My name is Nestor Matthews. I'm the chair of the Denison University Psychology Department, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Blowing Off S.T.E.A.M. S.T.E.A.M, of course, is an acronym for Science, Technology, Engineering, Arts, and Mathematics. I think I've got them all. And we do this on the first Tuesday of every second Tuesday of every month. And we're going to be taking a break for the academic summer, but we will be back in September. We're looking forward to having you join us if you would like. This Blowing Off S.T.E.A.M series is a collaboration across 3 different institutions. And it's been a great pleasure to work with Lucy Chin Parker, who's here tonight from the Granville Public Library. So Lucy, thank you for all that you've been doing and all your Zoom magic. Another collaborator that we typically have with us is Dr. Mike Stamatikos from OSU Newark. Mike is normally here, but this happens to be his 11th anniversary. And so we're giving him the night off for that. And we're hoping that he and his wife have a very happy, I think it's their 11th anniversary. So tonight we're here for a very special occasion. We have a terrific speaker, and it's my pleasure to introduce Mike Morris. At Denison University, Mike plays a central role in performing arts, where he wears many hats. Most notably, Mike is the director of Denison's Vail series for the performing arts, and that's a series that's brought in lots of very big name acts since 1979. Mike is also the director of Denison's Ensemble-in-Residence, and we might have a few of our ensemble members joining us tonight. That really pleases us. Before coming to Denison, Mike served as the first executive director of the Newark Midland Theater Association Incorporated. Mike has also been nominated on 2 occasions for the Governor's Award for the Arts in the category of Arts Administration. Tonight, Mike's talk is titled Green M&Ms, Really? The Art and Science of Presenting National Touring Artists. Welcome, Mike.
Thank you, Nestor. I had planned for this to be a very informal discussion, and seeing the faces in the view here, it will be even more so. I will also be aware that it is being recorded for possible viewing later too. So when Nestor asked me about doing this, I said, Nestor, I don't know. So I could tell war stories all night, but that's not what this is about. He said, no, tell war stories. So I'll try and draw a connection or two between STEAM and the arts, but there may also be a war story or two mixed in as we go along. Probably one of the real visible signs of where STEAM and the arts intersect, if you've been to an arena show or seen the big productions on television, the award shows and such, you've seen the big video walls. And certainly there's artistic talent taken just to design those. And then the engineering to put them together. And then if it's a touring show, the engineering required to make them easy to load in, load out, and then set up again in another town. In fact, some of those big arena shows, there are actually 2 complete touring sets. And while a show is up in Pittsburgh, there's another unit being set up in Columbus. And when the Pittsburgh show closes, that set goes to Indianapolis. When Columbus closes, it goes Chicago, St. Louis, wherever. So there's a lot of engineering, a lot of technology that has to go into making those sets, first of all, functional, then secondly, transportable. Many of us have watched Ethel's Documerica program. If you're not familiar with Documerica, I'll quote from the National Archives Prologue magazine. It says, quote, in 1971, the newly created Environmental Protection Agency announced a monumental photodocumentary project to record changes in the American environment. Documerica resulted in a collection of more than 20,000 photographs by its conclusion in 1978, end quote. 40 years later, those photos were all digitized, which made them much more accessible and malleable, if you will. Ethel chose about 200 of them and turned that into a multimedia show. They commissioned some compositions, wrote some themselves, and took it to a full-blown multimedia stage presentation. So the technology was employed going from 35 millimeter to digitized photo, and then translating that in an artistic way for the whole projection. You can find those photos on the National Archives website. Takes a little digging, but it's worth the effort. One place where you don't see technology and arts intersecting is in digital audio. Used to be that audio was all analog, and if you've been to concerts, you've seen the great big cables that ran from the audio board up to the stage. Snakes, what they are affectionately called. Those snakes were huge. They were hard to handle. Now that digital audio is taken the forefront, all that travels on the Cat5 cable like you use in your home computer. So that's made that much more accessible. Instead of a mixing board, you've all seen pictures, if you haven't seen them in person, of the huge boards with all the different faders and sliders. Now it's very compact, and instead of having that horizontal, it's vertical, and it's different screens. So there's one screen that you use for one set of adjustments. You go down a level and there's another screen, you go down another level and there's another screen, and it makes it much more compact. One of the advantages of digital audio is the immediacy. There is a mechanism by which you just plug a USB port into the audio board, and it will record the concert as it happens. When we presented David Crosby and Graham Nash, Sands, Stills, and Young at the Midland, before the show and at intermission, you could buy a token to buy that evening's performance on a USB drive. So while the show was in process, they were recording it. As soon as the show was over, they took that USB drive out of the soundboard, out of the mixing board, and they had a big box with about 50 blanks in it, 50 blank USB ports or USB drives in it. They took the master, plugged it in, pushed a button. 15 minutes later, they had 15 copies, or 50 copies, I'm sorry, of that particular show. So you could watch the show, 15 minutes later, walk out with a copy of it. There are obviously some advantages to digital audio. One of them is the ease of rigging, the range of adjustments. I already mentioned the immediacy. Another is that it's a great way to solve problems. At Swayze Chapel, you'll notice on the columns by the stage, there are two long 8-foot by 6-8 wide by 6-8 deep boxes on those columns on the stage. Those are the new speaker banks. In 2015, President Adam Weinberg charged me with upgrading the audio in Swayze Chapel. Prior to 2015, there was a center cluster way up in the ceiling, a center cluster of big speakers up in the ceiling. Swayze is a wonderful venue for acoustic performance, orchestral performance. It has about a 3-second delay. So you clap your hands, it's going to take 3 seconds for that sound to decay down to nothing. For orchestral performances, for acoustic performances, that's great because it warms up the sound. It's almost like a built-in reverb. But for spoken word, something you would be saying now would still be rattling around in the hall 3 seconds later. And I see a couple of smiles of people that have experienced that. The spoken word was often nearly impossible to understand unless the speaker was very slow and deliberate, which also carried some disadvantages to it. We contacted Meyer Audio, which is a premier audio manufacturer, said, we know you offer some specialized audio systems. What would you recommend? Said, well, we won't even talk to you until you have an acoustician do a study of the hall. So we did that and came back with a steerable line array as the suggestion. So in those long columns on the column at Swayze are 32 4-inch speakers in each of those little boxes. And each of those 4-inch speakers is aimed discreetly at a particular target within Swayze Chapel. If you think about the old system, the big center cluster way up in the ceiling, that threw sound every place. It was like a lantern. And the sound bounced off of everything in the hall. Think now about the steerable line array, and those little 4-inch flashlights are targeted very specifically and targeted away from those reverberant spaces. And it's made a huge difference in the audio at Swayze, especially for spoken word. So that's a big advantage to digital audio. There are some disadvantages. Purists would say that the analog delivers a warmer sound and is much more reliable. I won't argue that. Won't argue it for a minute. Did you ever have a computer glitch? Same thing can happen with a digital audio system. In fact, tonight, as I was coming in, I left the office this afternoon and the computer reminded me I needed to do an upgrade. So I did. Came back at quarter after six to boot the computer. It tells me it's going to be 45 to 50 minutes before the computer was up, which put me right at 7 o'clock. So I ran home, grabbed my personal computer, brought it in, booted it up. I am now on the office computer, which came up at 6:55. So even something as simple as this, if it's live, there's risk and there's excitement to it. You can have those kind of issues with the digital audio system too. On the lighting side of productions, there's a big move toward LED lights versus incandescent. There are a lot of advantages to LEDs. Certainly, energy use is one of them, and less heat generation is another. With the incandescent lights, everything ran through a dimmer rack, which was generally in a dimmer room, and because of the heat generated, had to be conditioned even above and beyond what happens in the audience chamber. With LED, I should say too that if you lose a dimmer rack, that's a major impact. With LED lights, each individual light has a dimmer. So if you lose one dimmer on one light, there are a lot of workarounds for that. It's less impactful if an LED light loses a dimmer versus the whole dimmer rack. Network connections with the LEDs and with the control system of those is just as temperamental and just as critical as it is with audio. There's another disadvantage to LEDs is their throw isn't as long as incandescents. In other words, you can't put them as far from the stage. So in Martin Hall at the Eisner Center, there's a mix of LEDs and traditional incandescents. So science, technology, engineering, math, all a part of presenting these days. And it's the title references the art of presenting. And I would suggest that there is an art to presenting, and I think it begins with listening. Listen to your audience. There's an old saying among presenters that should you present what the audience wants to hear, or should you present what you think they should hear? And the answer is yes. You should do both. Time and time again, I had volunteers at the Midland come up after a show and said, I would never have bought a ticket to this show. Never in a million years, but this is really neat. I'm going to check out some more of this. That's an advantage to listening to your audience. You begin to learn what will resonate. Also, at Denison, we want to be very very conscious of the campus conversation. I mentioned Ethel's Documerica project. There was an obvious connection with environmental studies with that particular show. And Ethel accompanied the members of an environmental studies seminar to a food production plant, a dairy farm, to a transportation facility, Port Columbus, John Glenn International, if you will. They took to a waste management, Swaco dump, and I'm missing one. Took it to these places, took field recordings, took photographs, turned to field recordings with Ethel's mentorship, turned those field recordings into compositions, combined those with the photos that were taken at these places for a wonderful evening. And props to one of our hosts, Nestor, for finding the connection between psychology and the arts. Whether it was a conversation with the nerd group, the Neurological Education Research of Denison. Did I get that right? Yeah. Whether it was with the nerd group talking about language and music, is it the same? Which came first? Does it matter? Or with our other Ensemble-in-Residence, Third Coast Percussion, talking about polyrhythms and brain function. Props to Nestor for finding those connections. We do find those connections. You listen to the campus conversation, you listen to your audience. So how does it seem? You need to listen to the agencies. They know what's going to happen before it happens, before it's announced. Two examples of that, Aoife O'Donovan, who we presented virtually last fall, was slated for a project that had not been announced with Goat Rodeo Session. And Goat Rodeo Session is Yo-Yo Ma, Stuart Duncan, Edgar Meyer, Chris Thiele. Aoife is a featured vocalist. And they were to have been touring, supporting that project about the time that they would have been at Denison last fall, or that Aoife would have been at Denison last fall. Anytime Yo-Yo Ma goes out, it gets a lot of attention. And by association, so would Aoife. Another example of that is Isabel Leonard, who was here with the Czech National Symphony Orchestra. Isabel was being groomed for a major role in the Metropolitan Opera's gala. That had not been announced, but they were booking the Czech National Symphony with her as the featured vocalist prior to that. So as that Czech National Symphony Orchestra tour was going on, Isabel was flying back and forth to New York to rehearse with Andrea Bocelli. So we learn these things through our agent friends before they become public knowledge. So those are the things that I think you need to listen to. I think you also need to listen to your gut. And if something resonates with you, if it catches your eye or ear, chances are pretty good that it will catch others as well. The technology is available today to sample a broad range of musical styles and genres, and that makes it that much easier. I would challenge everyone to do the very same. So the title of this was Green M&Ms, Really? The story on the green M&Ms, as I understand it, it may be urban legend, but the story as I understand it is that was off of an AC/DC contract rider. And it did indeed specify green M&Ms. Green M&Ms weren't the point. That particular show had a lot of pyrotechnics associated with it. And the thought was, if the producer had read the rider carefully enough to have green M&Ms in the dressing room, then they would also have read the rider carefully enough to pay attention to all the details with the pyrotechnics. And paying attention to pyrotechnics is kind of a big thing, you know? So that's the story as I understand it. Riders these days are much more manageable. If you're dealing with $1 million artist fee and 50% of the profit like you get at an arena show, there's probably a little more complicated than what we're seeing. But these days, I think presenters and audiences alike are aware that there is no correlation between name recognition and talent. There's a whole lot of talent out there. Again, the technology's there to sample it. You just don't have to put up with that any longer. So that's the story as I see it. I'm happy to answer any questions. And again, thank you for this opportunity, Nestor.
Mike, thank you. That was just fantastic. And we were hoping that Mike would talk for about 20 minutes to give us some background, and then we could just have discussion. So what I'd like to do is invite people to put their name, if you would, into the chat. And you don't have to type your question into the chat. And I'll call on folks and we'll invite you to unmute. While you're thinking of a question or a comment that you'd like to offer, I just have so many that have come to mind. I'm thinking about the incandescent lights and how they all have a dimmer switch. So I have older brothers that in the 1970s, late 1970s, they were the musicians and they had the rock band. And I was the younger brother, and my job was to work the dimmer switch on the lights that was hitting my brother's rock band. And I hadn't thought about that since the late 1970s. So thank you for taking me back to that. I didn't realize that each LED now had its own dimmer switch. But thank you for that, Mike. And I've got lots more to say, but Gil has a question. So Gil, thank you. Can you unmute, Gil?
Yeah, sure. So Mike, I've often wondered, and maybe it's the listening piece that you just suggested, but I've often wondered, in the Vail series, for example, there are so many artists, and also it developed from just music to so many disciplines. I'm wondering, how do you go about figuring out which artists to invite to Denison?
Oh, that's a good question. And it's a challenge. The range out there is so great that, and with only 4 slots that we can fit into an academic year, the Denison calendar is so full that it's really a challenge. Marla will attest to that, finding spots just for 2 concerts in a semester. We have an advisory group of faculty and a committee member, Tom, who's on this call, who help guide that process. We try and look at all the different ranges, and you can't do it in 1 year, but over 2 or 3 years, try and touch all those bases. I start with a long list of about 15 artists that have caught my eye and ear, whose story is compelling, who would have a connection on campus, and then start narrowing it down from there. Some are self-eliminated by scheduling. Somebody I've wanted to present for years has been Pat Metheny. Pat Metheny is only out about a month a year now, and it always seems to fall when we're on break. So one of my regrets I've come to realize is I'm not going to get to present Pat Metheny. So some of those are eliminated in that fashion. Others shift gears, and the project that they were working on, they decided not to tour. That eliminates. But we try some of the genres we pay particular attention to is the Vail series has a long and strong classical music heritage. We don't want to lose that. We've wanted to introduce international artists. Ladysmith Black Mambazo and the Afro-Peruvian sextet come to mind, that we want to touch that base. We want to touch jazz from time to time. With the Eisner Center now open, we have the technical capabilities to produce dance and theater. And last year with Olivier's group, Tarpaga, Baker Tarpaga Dance Group, we were able to do that. We probably wouldn't come back to dance in a year, probably do theater in Eisner for a year and then come back the next year with dance. The range, as you say, is just immense. And as I said earlier, there's a lot of talent out there. So what fits with the campus conversation at the time, a program we had scheduled for this spring, which we obviously had to move to next fall because of touring schedules, is Blackbird Fly, which is the story of Mark Bamuthi Joseph and Daniel Bernard Remain, and they are both sons of Haitian immigrants. So what a timely, what a time to present that particular show in this environment, and it will still be timely in the fall. So those are some of the criteria we use to choose. Does that help?
Yeah, I knew about the advisory committee, but I was sort of wondering from your point of view as the director, like, how much time do you spend tossing around, looking at, becoming familiar with, kind of searching in your own world of, of figuring out, well, here's some people that I might be interested in. Because it just seems like it's an enormous responsibility. A ton of fun, but wow, what a big job,
A lot of that's done just extemporaneously too. I happen to be watching something on television, say they'd be really cool to see at Denison, on an awards show or a Kennedy Center honors or something like that. Some of that happens that way. You develop a trust with agencies. Some agents, regardless what they're talking to you about, it's the best thing to come along in the last 20 years. Well, they're being agents, let's be honest about it. Then others, IFA's agent, Seth Molaski, we joke about him being a typical agent, but he really isn't. He called me up one day and said, Mike, I got something I think you'd be interested in. He said, Aoife O'Donovan's going out with Jeremy Kittle's string quartet doing music that is based on the late poet laureate of Oregon, Peter Sears. And he said, knowing your interdisciplinary approach, that just seems like a natural. So those kind of things come to you naturally after you develop these relationships too. I get 20 emails a day from agencies promoting different artists. You can look at them pretty quick and know which ones, okay, that's, been down that road, worked with this agency, never again, those kind of things. That helps weed it out too.
Mike, that's so helpful, and I really appreciate Gil's question. I wanted to know if we might take a message that's come to me. We have somebody who's messaged me and asked that Mike might perhaps tell the story of the development of the Ethel relationship. So we've been with Ethel for a while, but how did that relationship develop? If you can take us down that road, please.
Yeah, this is a fun one, not just because of the outcome. My first year with Vail series, I was a production coordinator for Lorraine Wales. There as a contract employee, contractor, not an employee, contractor. And she had three of the four booked. And she was struggling with that fourth one. And we were talking one day and she said, what do you think about this group, Ethel? And I said, well, I know they toured with Todd Rundgren, and one of the stops was at the Midland Theater. And I said, while Nancy Anderson, who was now the director at the Midland Theater, who, by the way, was a volunteer the night we opened and eventually became my assistant director there, said that while Mr. Rundgren was miserable to work with, that Ethel was wonderful and gave one of the best master classes she had ever seen at Newark High School. So I told Lorraine about that, and she said, well, that's who I'll book then. So she booked them for that fall. It had been fall of 2013. They had a great show. They ended with Enrico. Oh, I can't remember the name of the piece now. It was a movie track, but at any rate, very moving piece. At the reception following the performance, Ralph, who many of us know and love, came up to me and said, Mike, we've got to be your ensemble in residence. Well, we'll look into that, Ralph. Everybody wants to come back, right? So I said, we'll look into that, Ralph. Well, that same night, he went to Ching Chu Hu and said, Ching Chu, we got to be your ensemble in residence. Ching Chu gave much the same answer that I did. Well, we'll think about that. That has promise. We'll think about it. Well, Ralph also went to President Weinberg and said, we need to be your ensemble in residence. And Adam gave much the same response, but about 2 weeks later, he stopped me on the quad and said, hey, Mike, this Ralph guy from Ethel, he said they'd like to be our ensemble in residence. What do you think? What would that look like? I said, well, if you're interested, let's take a peek at it. I said, I'll come up with a pro forma week that they might have when they were here. So talking about agencies that you trust, Mark Baylin, who just closed his agency, retired before COVID hit, I should say, just closed his agency. We were on the phone for about 45 minutes, talked about what they might do and might not do. We talked about Kip's interest in the environment. He is now on the advisory group with Homestead at Denison. We talked about a variety of interests that they each have individually, some of the content of their music, and put together a pro forma and met with Adam, showed it to him, said, this is what we could do in a week. This is what we might do in a second week. We've never had a shortage of ideas with Ethel. This is what we could do in a second week. This is about what it would cost. He said, well, I think we ought to try it. He said, give me a little bit to come up with the money. And he called me about 48 hours later and said, I got the money, let's do it. So that's how it started, and it's blossomed since then.
Spectacular. I'm so glad it did, because they've touched so many of us. So that's just been absolutely wonderful. So I didn't know Ralph was working the room that night, though. That was pretty good on his part too.
Have you ever known Ralph not to work a room?
All right. Really, really great stuff. There's so many ways to go here. I'm a little bit curious if you could say something about the Vail series students, right? So we bring in these wonderful artists, but what a spectacular opportunity for the students themselves who are part of the Vail series. I wonder if you'd comment a little bit on their role through the years.
Sure. We have about 30 to 40, and Marla, I'm going to rely on you to help me fill in the blanks here. Marla works very closely with the student group. We have a group of about 30, 35 students. They are organized as a lead intern who introduces the shows. I'm happy to say that's an innovation that I brought, to have the student introduce the shows. The lead intern introduces the concerts. We have an ushering intern who organizes the Vail series staff to welcome people to Swayze Chapel. And we tell them, you're not just ushering, you're guarding the Vail series experience and providing for the safety of our audience. So the intern we have for ushering, we also have an intern for marketing, one for ticketing. That has morphed in the ticketing. We used to hand out a hard ticket, and you had to get a ticket, you had to go to a table and get a ticket. So we had a group to do that. The ticketing tables are now more of an serve an educational function in pulling people in, telling them about the artist, the ensemble that we're going to be presenting. And we have an intern then for social media. So it's ushering, social media, marketing, and ticketing. And then we have a group of 30 beyond that. If it hasn't launched careers in arts administration, it's certainly developed an appreciation and for the arts. I hear from folks from time to time. A matter of fact, our lead intern from 3 years ago, Heather, is now a student at Boston University getting her master's in arts administration. And our ushering intern from 2 years ago, Adriana Collada, was making application for arts administration. But somehow she got this temporary position at the at the French Embassy in Washington, D.C. and she's going to take that instead. I guess can't be too upset about that. When Baker Tarpaga Dance Group was here, they're from, most of their members are only French speaking, and Adriana rounded up a few of her fellow French majors to serve as interpreters. That gesture was greatly appreciated by Olivier and his group.
Excellent, excellent.
Marla, did I miss anything
Please go ahead, Marla.
to add?
No, I don't think so. We make sure that, like Mike said, at the end of the year, we kind of tell them as they go start their job search for after graduation or even summer work that we meet with the Knowlton Center and explain, yeah, you're not just handing someone a program at a concert. You are maintaining safety, crowd control, you are hospitality, you are safety. We are ushers. Our ushers are all, or I mean, our staff is also called on to do other things on campus because they have a good reputation for knowing how to manage a crowd professionally. And so that's something that Mike built in, and that's great. And just like he had Midland volunteers say this, we very often have our students come out after a concert and say, I would never have gone to that concert on my own. I cannot believe how much I loved that Czech's National Symphony Orchestra, or some of them had tears in their eyes during that performance too with some of their songs. And so it's about expanding our students' horizons too, and in their music selection that they may not have gone to otherwise.
Marla, thank you. And Mike, thank you. It's so great how you engage so many of our students. You know, when we think of the Vail series, we think of the great artists and all the great moments that we have with the artists, but so much is happening through our students because of the work that you're doing. And what a wonderful development opportunity it is for our students. So thank you for all of that. I did want to get back to a question that ran through my mind. Mike was pointing out that somebody had retired even before the pandemic hit. And of course, the pandemic brought us into the world of Zoom. And so I wonder if Mike might like to speculate a little bit on how Zoom and Zoom technology and other video conferencing technology might shape performing arts in general, and maybe also our relations with artists in residence and the Vail series.
Yeah, I think we're all hungry to be in person again. I don't think that the virtual world will go away, but I think its uses will be pretty selective in how we use that. One of the advantages of our artists in residence, ensembles in residence this whole year have been virtual. And one of the advantages of that is that when they are on campus, we are time limited. They arrive at Monday at noon and they leave Saturday afternoon or Sunday morning, depending on what the schedule calls for. And if your particular plans don't line up with that week, then love to do it, but can't, right? So with the virtual world, we could say we have X number of, usually there's 12 to 15 contacts that an ensemble in residence will make in a week. So we shifted to say, okay, after you've had 12 to 14 virtual contacts, we'll consider that 1 week. And so we put the call out to faculty, to others, saying, hey, we've got these contacts with Ethel. It can happen anytime during the fall. We have TCP available in the spring. It can happen anytime in the spring. Tell us what you'd like to do. We'll arrange it. I think some of that will continue to go on. One of the advantages of that is that you can visit a class, for instance, a music composition class, early in the semester, lay some groundwork, give some tips, come back later in the semester for critiques and fine tuning. The same thing could be said across the spectrum, across all disciplines. So I think we'll take advantage of some of that. I think virtual concerts, I don't know. I think live streaming in conjunction with a live performance, there may be some of that. Certainly in our particular instance, there's advantages to that because our Vail students, speaking of whom, their parents never get to see what they do unless they are within driving range. I think especially of our international students. But when we had virtual concerts last fall to this spring, their parents were able to see what they were involved with when they were here on campus. Students, student performers, student artist parents can now see what they may have missed otherwise. I think some of that will continue, but I don't think it will be as extensive as it is now.
If I can jump in, one of the
Please.
funniest technology moments I saw this semester with a visiting artist, and it was Daniel Bernard Romain, who's coming next year for a Vail performance. Chris Westover had his Wind Symphony Orchestra working with Daniel Bernard Romain, and I said, can I come in and take some photos? It was in Sharon Martin Hall. So the wind ensemble had turned their chairs and we're facing the back wall, not the audience, but the back wall. And here is Daniel Bernard Romain on the full-size wall screen, bigger than like the Wizard of Oz that you see. And he's just talking and he's just huge. And that's technology. I mean, how do you bring in an artist to a whole ensemble so the whole ensemble can see them? So that was one creative use of technology. And Sharon Martin.
And we haven't mentioned Marla's a Vail series assistant. I should have introduced her as such earlier. Gil, do you have any thoughts about that? About the lifespan of digital, virtual?
I mean, it's been a really interesting transition from the immediate shutdown a year ago, March, and the I want to say, with all due reverence, the kind of lack of knowledge we had in those first 6 or 8 weeks when we were like, what? Do what? Do it how? And I think, at least for me, and I don't think I was alone, there was a pretty straight and narrow, like, figure out the Zoom, make sure all your students are there. There was something about it that was almost mechanistic, and then over the course of that 6 or 8 weeks, there was a transition that started to happen. Okay, I don't need to worry about the technology. I know how to do that part now. I can be a little braver in what I'm offering. And I had students, as did many of us, who were far away in different countries. And so consequently different time zones. And so there were a lot of complicated issues to figure out. All right, so that was then. This year, I think the trajectory over the year has opened us up to a lot of the pluses of technology and all of the pluses that the virtual performance can do. I know that I was teaching a class and I had a guest person, a guest dancer teach from California who was teaching in 2 studios simultaneously because we could only have 12 students in each studio, right? But the guest teacher was in California. And what we began to realize early on was that we could have a lot of interactions with very famous people. For the famous person, it was a short obligation, right? 2 hours perhaps, right? But our students over the course of the semester then got all these incredible experiences firsthand from the people that we were reading about or the videos we were watching of them dancing, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of artists were willing to do that because live performance for them was canceled as well, right? Their touring was canceled as well. So I just thought it was an amazing thing. What I've heard recently from my artist peers or colleagues, they're not peers, they're professional artists. But what I've heard more recently is, can you please do some of this again next year, even if the pandemic is not happening, because it was so much fun for many of those artists who ordinarily don't connect in to the student body in that way, to have that experience and to do just as you were saying, guest teach early in the semester, come back and see what they're doing mid-semester, come a 3rd time at the end of the semester. So I think we've learned a lot and grown a lot from the virtual experiences that we've had, and I really hope that half of it or more continues
Yeah.
in different ways. Take advantage of those things.
A couple of things came to mind as you were talking, Gil. The first is an artist fee for, pardon my going to the profit and loss statement, but the artist fee for a virtual appearance is much less than it is for an in-person appearance, because as you said, you're only tying up an hour or two. I had one of the artists, I think it was Sam Bush, said, "Hey, we play for free. We're paid to travel." So if they don't have to travel, they can take a lot less money. The second thing is, you said we were feeling our way out. Marla can flesh this out a little bit maybe, but everybody's industry-wide, and I use the term industry intentionally, industry-wide, we're still trying to figure out this streaming thing for the rights, and YouTube has an algorithm. If they pick up the certain pattern of notes, they say, "Oh, that's somebody, do you have the rights?" And they'll shut you down. And we're not quite sure how that works, and they're not quite sure how that works. And you attend webinars. I think what we've learned is if somebody says this is the way it is, you're very suspicious, because nobody knows what it is right now. Nobody knows. So there's still a lot of sorting out going on that front. It will continue to be sorted out.
Yeah, I think it's exciting to have the combination of live entertainers here and in person, but also the idea that we can connect with them. I want to pick up on what Gil was saying, and that is, if I could have 3 interactions across the semester with the members of Ethel or the members of Third Coast Percussion, and they give a little introduction early on, and then they check in half the way through, and then again, my students would love it. They would get 3 breaks from me instead of 1 break from me, and the students always appreciate that. And those groups are just so good with our students. I'm sure they're selected in part by how well they interact with students, but it's nice to think about that technological possibility. I also really appreciate the point that was being made earlier. Our students do so much work in the Vail series, and some of their parents, if they're from another country, never get to see that. And so for the parents to be able to see what their kids are doing with Vail as one example, that's really a great feature of the technology, which is exciting. I'm going to change threads here just a little bit, because somebody's chimed in with another question that I'd like to read. And this one's going to go to Mike. And we're going to ask Mike to maybe comment a little bit on how Swayze crowd behavior works, crowd control behavior. Sometimes you have to control for coughers or criers or loud talkers acoustically. And I wonder if you can say something about your efforts to try to control those.
Yeah, it's an interesting dynamic, the way crowds behave differently in different venues. One of the biggest issues we face, and this is a real pet peeve of mine, is there's often so much movement during a concert, and we put it in the program, if you must leave, do so between numbers, and leave and re-enter between numbers. We also began announcing that from the stage. And one of the things that our interns and Vail student staff members are told repeatedly is we have somebody on the inside and somebody on the outside. If somebody's trying to get in during a number, we don't let them. And if somebody's trying to get out, we open the door. As far as coughers, sometimes you can be more disruptive trying to usher that person out or hand them a cough drop than you can trying to solve the problem. Yeah. Talkers, same thing. If you have to kind of choose your spots to tap somebody on the shoulder and say, please. But overall, crowd at Swayze is pretty easy compared to some.
I think we have more issues with people using their phones to film or take photos, which it's typically not ever allowed. Yeah,
and the range of attitudes among artists and ensembles about that is all across the board too. Some say, sure, tape it, put it on YouTube, please. And others say, no, that's a no. He's taping, stop him, that kind of thing. Another issue with the phones is if you're sitting behind somebody, even 3 or 4 rows, and they've got the screen up, it's distracting.
Yeah.
So we try and control that for both reasons. Yeah, it's a pretty quiet crowd. I mentioned Sam Bush earlier. We had a dancer at Sam Bush's concert, and he and his partner were back in the back, and they were dancing, enjoying the show. Fine, no problem. I went back outside to check on something, came back in, and they were gone. And I looked up, and they were down by the green room, off of stage right, in that stairwell down, dancing back there. So on a sprint, I was down underneath Swayze, back up the other side. Say, hey, pal, this ain't going to get it. Sorry, man, sorry. Come on, follow me. Let's go. And so took him back out, put him back out front. That's about the closest thing we had to a crowd control issue in the last 8 years.
You have to watch out for those dancers.
Yeah, he can dance any place he wants to, but just not up front next to Sam Bush's dressing room.
I bet that the idea that you have with the cell phones and recording, and some artists are saying, hey, put it on YouTube, that's fine with me. Others are very strict about that. It must get enormously complicated with copyright. I know that I'm a fan of Drum Corps International, and I go to many of their shows, and every year they have their summer tour. And then usually around October, November, they try to get all that stuff on some kind of a video recording and share it. And usually the big showstopper there is, a given performance will often be a mashup of 9 or so different songs by, I don't know how many different publishers. And you've got 7 or 8 different drum corps doing that. Okay, so you actually need some kind of legal confirmation from a very unwieldy number of publishers, right? So I can appreciate that some of the artists might want to guard their own intellectual property. In other cases, maybe they're doing a cover, and they know how complicated that can get. So I can imagine the copyright is another complicating factor.
Yeah, I spoke with Rich Corsi, who's a vice president programming for Kappa. He and I have known each other for a long time. We talk from time to time. And I asked him about the streaming rights issue. And he said, his take on it is exactly the same as mine. He said, one way you can be sure to get caught is to use, they were doing a hometown series. And one of the young artists, just out of high school, I want to say, was doing a cover of a song, and she used the actual soundtrack minus the voice, kind of karaoke-like. And they got about 6 bars into this song and they shut it down.
Right.
YouTube shut it down.
Yeah. Mike, we do have a few minutes left, and we do have time for a couple of other questions. But when Mike was giving the main part of his talk, he was mentioning the different artists he was hoping to get. And it might have been in response to one of Gil's questions, which was, how do you pick up these different artists? And in passing, Mike was talking about Pat Metheny, who he was hoping to get here, but Pat is only out and touring one month a year. And so it looked like that might not happen. I think Mike was the one who told me a wonderful Pat Metheny story with a connection to David Baker. And I wonder if I got that from Mike, or if I'm not remembering correctly. And I want to point this out partly because David Baker is going to be retiring. And looks like maybe we're not going to get Pat Metheny. So this might be our one chance to get the Pat Metheny, David Baker connection out there, Mike. So if you wouldn't mind, can you recall what you shared?
Yeah, the story as I remember it is that David Baker wanted to be a professional jazz musician. And when he was in high school, he entered a contest, statewide contest for jazz musicians. And then there were saxophones, and there were, down the line. So he's in the guitar, he plays first. He listens to everybody in the group. And he said, man, I'm going to win this thing. And the last person came on, and he said, wow, I'll never be that good. And that's why he became a poet. And the last person that was on was Pat Metheny. And they became friends after that. And I guess they're still in touch from time to time.
Wow. Great story.
I hope that the spirit of that story is correct. I don't know if the details are or not, but
Right.
one should never let the facts get in the way of a good story.
Excellent. Excellent. See if we have any other comments or questions from our group here.
I just, for some reason, I feel compelled to say the Natalie McMaster show that Vail did. She was I'm going to say an Irish step dancer. I'm sure there are subdivisions of that, but just generally speaking, and for the sake of the recording. And it was my introduction to anything other than the kind of river dance, Irish step dancing. And I was blown away, absolutely blown away by that Vail concert. And, and then as I put my memory hat on, I think of the multiple times that I was introduced to something at Vail. You were saying earlier that you've heard people say, perhaps students say, gee, I never would have bought a ticket to this. I'm so glad I came. But I think the same thing holds true for a lot of faculty, and the performing arts has been my entire life. I've seen tons and tons of dance, probably as much bad dance as good dance, we like to say. Do you know what I mean? But the Vail series has really been such an incredible gift on that one-on-one level. I mean, I know it's brought all kinds of accolades to the university, and very famous people have played here, and our students get to interact. I know all of the, all the bylines, but I also think it's so refreshing as a faculty member, and this is where I work, to be able to go back to the workplace and have such joy and such pleasure and such an experience that is just nourishing for every single cell in our bodies. And it doesn't seem to matter which Vail performance it is, they all do that. So I just really wanted to take a moment to say thank you so much for carrying that on, and really doing the listening that you were talking about earlier on, and knowing kind of what the pulse is underneath it all, and what would be valuable and pleasurable, and what's needed by the community right now. I'm really grateful. So thank you, Mike.
Thanks. It's humbling to be the director of this series because of that long legacy, and it's not something I've taken lightly.
Well, you've done it quite well, and I'm grateful. Thanks.
Great. Yes, I would echo Gil's idea there. I mean, I remember going into the Vail series so many times, and just coming out of there so rejuvenated, and thinking that what a wonderful opportunity and resource this is for our community. And it wouldn't happen without people like you, Mike and Marla. So we thank you for all of those great concerts. I'm looking forward to the series continuing in person, we hope, next semester. And we thank you especially for joining us tonight, Mike. Your thoughts have brought us together one more time. Can we give a round of applause to Mike, Zoom style, by going on to your reactions? There they are.
Right. All right.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody. Have a good night.